Hello and welcome to Eyes Open Network Developing News Story. Reading an article today on Sputnik News. There's been rumors for a long time circulating that Turkey is planning to send ground troops to Syria, which started on the weekend. And although Ankara has repeatedly denied these claims, the ruling AKP party in fact wants to annex part of the war-torn Arab country. This was quoted: forthcoming planned invasion of Syria by Turkish and Saudi ground forces, according to the Geopolitical analyst, was discussed at a NATO headquarters on the same day a ceasefire agreement was reached at the Munich Security Conference. This meeting was called to order and brought about by the Secretary of Defense, or Defense Secretary Ashton Carter. So it was initiated by the US. So the fact that we have Turkish soldiers invading Syria already, and we have the US-backed Pentagon coordinating offensives with Saudi Arabia and Turkey and other mercenaries in the area. Listen to this clip, 4-minute audio clip. Will sort of sum things up for you, and we'll get right back to you.
First, I'd like to put into context the events of the last few days with regard to negotiations both in Munich and in Brussels. There was an agreement in Munich under the Syria support group to reach some form of a ceasefire. Now, what public opinion is not aware of is that on the same day as this agreement was reached, there was a meeting behind closed doors in Brussels. It was at NATO headquarters. It was not called by NATO. It was called by the Pentagon. It was an initiative of the Pentagon with Defense Secretary Carter present and chairing the meeting, and also present at that meeting were the main protagonists in the forthcoming planned invasion of Syria, namely Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And the Crown Prince, Defense Minister of Saudi Arabia, was present and had meetings behind closed doors with Defense Secretary Carter. And this pertains to the plan, the ground invasion of Syria by Saudi forces as well as by Turkish forces. But of course, Turkish forces are already there. So what is really new in these developments is the fact that Saudi Arabia, on the request of the United States, would be involved in ground operations, always under the pretext of going after the ISIL or Daesh terrorists, which happen to be supported, recruited, and funded by Saudi Arabia. So we're in an absurd situation with regard to who are the enemies, who are the friends, and so on and so forth. But that is the nature of this absurd fake diplomacy. But I think what is important to underline there is that both Saudi Arabia and Turkey are maybe involved in a process of boots on the ground. Turkey is already there, but it would be coordinated between these two countries. Riyadh and Ankara are collaborating specifically in that regard. But it was very clear in the statements made by Saudi Arabia that they would only intervene at the request of the United States. In other words, Saudi Arabia is not acting on its own behalf, it's acting on behalf of the United States. And in effect, this really means that U.S.-supported forces would be inside Syria. This process goes ahead. And the situation of Turkey is somewhat different because Turkey is not a 100% proxy of the United States. It has its own agenda. Of course, it has borders with Syria. It wants to annex part of Syrian territory. But nonetheless, I can say, knowing how decisions are taken from the military standpoint, everything is coordinated at the level of NATO, the Pentagon, and the various partners, so that in effect, what we are dealing with is not an invasion by Turkey and Saudi Arabia. It is an invasion which is sponsored by the United States, coordinated by the Pentagon and NATO. So that is the context. And of course, if this proceeds, any kind of confrontation between, let's say, Saudi or Turkish forces and Syria's main allies, Iran and Russia could lead into a process of escalation. And this was, of course, underscored by the Russian Prime Minister at the Munich Security Conference. So that is the context, and it's extremely dangerous crossroads which could potentially lead to a much broader war, whereby, because up to now it has been a war against terrorists, and it's a war of the terrorists supported by the Western military alliance against Syria. And of course, everybody knows that these terrorists are supported. They're the foot soldiers of the Western military alliance. But now that they've been defeated largely with the support of the Russian bombing campaign, we're moving into a new scenario which could lead to, in fact, which is more of a theater type of war with conventional forces from Turkey, Syria, special forces from the Western military alliance, including US, mercenaries, intelligence ops, etc., on the ground, and that could lead to confrontation between, let's say, Turkey and Russia, possibly, which then would imply also the possible involvement of NATO, given the fact that there's a collective security agreement between NATO states. So that is the situation we are in at the moment.
I mean, there you have it, folks. You've heard it here on Eyes Open Network many, many times that World War III has already begun, that 5 years ago when the Syrian war began, that this was the launching of World War III. I want to read to you something else that I found today, that it was pulled off of a news site. Before It's News is what it's called, and then it was reproduced, sort of cleaned up a bit and brought into another post. I'm just going to read it because I've found that there are many times in my comment section of this YouTube channel, many people often think that I'm fear-mongering and that I'm here at the Eyes Open Network we're trying to scare people or put false truths or speak from a certain perspective. We're just trying to get the information out there, and I think that this article was very, very good at breaking down exactly what's been going on in the Middle East for the last 5 years and where it's come to at this point. So if after you hear this, and I'll put it into the comments, I'll put it into the description below, if after you read this you still don't get it, then I suggest you get back to work and doing some research, because you're out of the loop. This starts with Russian Prime Minister warning US and Arab countries that invading Syria will start a new world war, which you have heard here on the Eyes Open Network days ago. The article that was originally written was called World War III was 18 days away, because it was written in February 13th or 14th, and it was basically suggesting that by the end of February that this was going to become a real big deal. Russia has publicly warned Saudi Arabia, the US, and other countries the risk of a new world war if they act on plans and send troops into Syria. Here are the actual facts that you need to know. Syria in the Middle East is suffering from a civil war which has been going on for 5 years. Rebels have been trying to overthrow Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The rebels are backed by Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, Kuwait, Pakistan, and other Sunni Muslim countries. These Sunni Muslim countries do not like that Syria's President Bashar al-Assad is an Alawite Muslim with beliefs closer to the Shia Islam, the Iranian version of that religion. Shias and Sunnis are ideological enemies on a horrific scale. It is in the interest of the Sunni nations to have Assad overthrown so that they can enjoy hegemony over Syria and bring it into Sunni sphere of influence, as opposed to Syria getting closer to Iran and their Shia version of Islam. The US has backed the rebels because, for whatever reason, we wanted Syria destabilized. I say oil. Does anybody else have any opinion? Of course it's oil, as we did with Iraq. Libya and pretty much every other nation we screwed up for the past decade. In short, we in the US and our allies are backing rebels who are trying to overthrow the Syrian government. We're backing the bad guys. Syria has always been a military ally of Russia, and Russia has deep Russia has a deep water port in Syria, which is important to the Russian Navy. When it became clear that it became clear to Russia that Syria was going to fall to the rebels, Russia announced that they were coming to the aid of their ally at the request of Syria and with its permission. The rebels, terrorists, and the accomplices. So this is to organize this group. These rebels, quote unquote, are a murky bunch. Some call themselves the Free Syrian Army, while others are part of the al-Nusra Front. But the rebels are also cozy with folks in Al-Qaeda and ISIS, who are outright terrorists. ISIS takes over entire regions of countries, steals the resources, and uses the cash from the stolen resources to fund its worldwide terror attacks in Syria. ISIS controls the second largest city, Aleppo, and another smaller city, Raqqa, in Iraq. ISIS controls Mosul. These are oil-rich areas in which of the two countries, and ISIS has been stealing the oil. What the rest of the world, which people who on the Eyes Open Network often forget, didn't really realize until recently, was that Turkey has been covertly working with ISIS. Turkey has been allowing literally thousands of oil tanker trucks from Iraq and Syria to carry stolen oil into Turkey every day, where it is slightly refined, repackaged to look legitimate, and sold on the cheap so that no one asks any questions. This oil theft operation has netted ISIS $100 million per month. Now, so here's where Russia enters to assist their ally. When Russia enters the Syrian fight, they had two targets: rebels who are trying to overthrow Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and number two, the terrorists. Russia has excellent intelligence gathering systems and very good spy satellites and very good signals intelligence, which spies on electronic communications. Through these systems, Russians came to know where ISIS was operating and how. Russia began attacking them with airstrikes. This severely affected the flow of stolen oil. With less stolen oil flowing, less money is coming in, and everyone who was in on the stolen oil money started losing profits. The highest levels of the Turkish government, including the president and his sons, are in on the oil smuggling. With Russia putting a damper on the stolen oil and cutting into profits, Turkey decided to send Russia a message to knock it off. They shot down a Russian bomber. You may recall at the time Russian President Putin described this as a stab in the back of Russia by accomplices of terrorism. No one understood what quote-unquote accomplices of terrorism meant until Russia's intelligence people revealed publicly surveillance videos of the convoys of oil trucks carrying stolen oil to Turkey. Then everything became quite clear. In the ensuing months, Russia has made incredibly good progress against both the rebels and the terrorists. They are really doing a lot of good there. But this is interfering with Saudi Arabia's grand plans. Turkey's stolen oil money profits and their intent of other Sunni Muslim countries to control Syria. It is also riling the US, who wants Assad out. So the rebels are losing, and Saudi begins to talk about invasion. And of course, Saudi Arabia has been very vocal that they will not take any action unless they are asked to by the US. That's important to remember. So last week, Syrian forces, with Russian and Iranian help, began encircling the city of Aleppo, Syria. When Saudi Arabia and its pals saw that Aleppo was being circled and would fall, they knew that the entire effort to overthrow Assad would fall too. Aleppo is key rebel terrorist stronghold, and if it goes, the fight is done for the rebels. So last week, Saudi Arabia publicly floated the idea of sending 150,000 ground troops into Syria to fight ISIS. Well, everyone who knows what's really going on now, especially after listening to that audio previously, that the Saudis are full of it. They don't want to fight ISIS. They want to help the rebels overthrow Assad. Turkey wants to protect ISIS so that they can keep grabbing boatloads of cash from the stolen oil. Nobody who mattered looked at Saudi offer seriously, because everyone knows what's really going on. This did not sit well with the Saudis or the US. So the US Defense Secretary Ash Carter publicly described the Saudi offer of 150,000 ground troops as a good idea, which he would discuss with other allies. Hence the meeting in the NATO offices. Syria and Russia both read between the lines and saw the writing on the wall. If the foreign ground troops come in, it will not be to fight ISIS. It will be to support the rebels and overthrow Assad. So Syria's foreign minister went public and said, No one should think that they can challenge Syria's territorial sovereignty, and anyone who tries to will be sent home in a wooden coffin. That's a quote. Then a member of Russian state parliament publicly stated that, quote, if any foreign troops enter Syria without permission from the Syrian government, Russia will consider that a declaration of war. The world took a pregnant pause. These are heavy-duty words from Russia, which is not, like it or not, a superpower. Wednesday, this past week, just under a week ago, the intelligence community has reported that Saudi Arabia and 25 of its allies had begun massing troops in the northern Saudi Arabia. This time it wasn't 150,000 that were mentioned earlier. This time it was 350,000 ground troops. Then that's when everything went south. When it was confirmed that the Saudis and their allies were already transporting 20,000 tanks. Worse, 2,450 warplanes were en route to northern Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis have declared the airspace in northern section of the country to be closed. Lastly, in addition to the 2,450 warplanes, 460 military helicopters are en route as well. Saudi Arabia had the, had the balls to claim that this was part of an exercise. That's absolute horse shit. There has never in the history of human existence been an exercise with 350,000 troops, 20,000 tanks, 2,450 warplanes, and 460 military helicopters. There's just no way an exercise of that magnitude. It's just too large. What's really taking place is the massing of an invasion force. Saudi Arabia also said the exercise would take 18 days. That would put the ending date near the February 28th timeline I mentioned earlier. When this info came out, Russia repeated its warning that any foreign troops entering Syria without permission would be a declaration of war. This time there is no pause. This time Saudis had one of their brig generals come out on TV and state that, quote, the decision to send ground troops into Syria is final. That statement came out earlier today, which was on the weekend, which is what the date that they're referring to. The weekend being of February 13th and 14th. Late this afternoon, on the 13th of February, Defense Secretary Ash Carter announced that he was asking NATO allies to join the U.S. coalition to send ground troops into Syria. That's a quote. This is directly threatening the Russians that they will be facing NATO. The Russian response was very swift, because from the same evening that Ash Carter made his announcement, Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev warned that, quote, the demands of some Arab countries to send ground forces into Syria risk starting a new world war. The Russian Prime Minister said sending troops to Syria risks drawing, quote, everyone taking part in it into a war, and drastically escalating the conflict, essentially changing it from proxy war to full-on war, which was mentioned in that audio clip. All operations, all ground operations, as a rule, lead to permanent wars, he said. Continuing his quote, the Americans must consider, both the U.S. President and our Arab partners, whether they want a permanent war. Russia again repeated its warning that any foreign ground troops entering Syria without permission would be a declaration of war. Late of the same evening that these two guys were jockeying for position verbally, verbal jousting, if you will, the Irish Times broke news that the intent of Saudi Arabia sending ground forces is to, quote, counter Russia. Now, wait a minute. What are we talking about here? When did this change? When did this mission change from fighting ISIS to quote countering Russia? That's a very different mental approach. So, as you have heard here on the Eyes Open Network, you are being witness to and watching the final pieces of World War III being put into operation. I find it hard to believe that I'm watching and taking a front seat in the theater to see this is actually and literally watching World War III become a reality for people who think that I'm just fear-mongering. 18 days we're talking here, end of February. Here's the worst part. When NATO was first created to protect Europe from the big bad Soviet Union, the Soviets enjoyed huge advantages in military force. Russia could field 100 divisions. NATO could only field 12. Russia could field 18,000 tanks. NATO could only field about 5,000. So NATO adopted the flexible response strategy. That's a quote. The only possible way to delay or halt the advance of 100 army divisions and 18,000 tanks is to use tactical battlefield nuclear weapons as a force multiplier. NATO thus no longer needed to match the size and strength of Russia because a doctrine had been adopted to equal the balance of power by using tactical nukes. The deterrent threat of that possibility worked, and it kept the peace. Fast forward to today, to this very moment, the only way to stop 350,000 ground troops with 20,000 tanks coming at you is to use tactical nukes. There simply is no other choice. Russia has adopted the first strike doctrine. If Russia or its territories or its interests are faced with being overrun, they will use tactical nukes to deal with that problem. So here we have it. Russia now faces being overrun in Syria starting at the end of February, and the only possible way they can stop 350,000 ground troops backed by 20,000 tanks is use tactical nukes. Their former policy is to do exactly that. Hence, battlefield nuclear weapons will be used. There's no way to avoid it because it's the only possible defense against this massive assault. As the artillery-fired nuclear shells start detonating, there will be spread radiation into Jordan or Iraq, depending on whichever nation is the entry point for the massive troops. Wind will carry the radiation deep into these countries. Perhaps very small devices will be launched by undetectable cruise missiles directly into Saudi Arabia because of the massive troops are coming from. Again, the wind will carry the fallout elsewhere inside the nation. And here's where the Eyes Open Network gets its frustration. The American media is completely silent. You don't hear this on mainstream media anywhere. You don't hear anything about all these little details that are going on over there in the Middle East. This is by design. They want to keep you, the American people, North American people, completely taken out of the loop and completely by surprise. And then when war breaks out, so you'll be completely scared and think too scared to think, and instead you'll do whatever the politicians tell you to do. And when this war breaks out, and potentially the end of February, and the Russians do what they must to protect Syria from being overrun, the only thing the American public will be told is Russia attacked Saudi Arabia with nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia is our ally, and we're going to help them. That's what you're going to be told. Not the truth, but that's what you're going to be told. This is an American Pentagon offensive in Syria, and it's going to be spun that Russia's attacking Saudi Arabia. Watch for it. Completely ignorant to all of us, completely ignorant of who is really the bad guy here, Sunnis and the US. We will hear that Russia attacked our allies with nukes. We'll all gasp in horror and say to ourselves, those bastards, and off to war we'll go. Got it? Let's keep this all in mind. I need you to open up your eyes, do some research, and pay attention. This has been an Eyes Open Network News Update.